Welcome to eBible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. And now, here's Chris McCann.
Hello and welcome to eBible Fellowship's Bible study in the book of Genesis. Tonight is study number 37 in Genesis chapter 40, and we're spending some time in the book of Esther looking at two of King Ahasuerus' chamberlains named Bigthan and Teresh. I kind of mixed them together. Bigthan and Teresh, which kept the door, and they were angry. They were full of wrath against the king and sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. And we've been looking at this as a historical parable because it is. You know, this is the Bible. You have to look for the deeper spiritual meaning, or what would be the point of telling us this. You know, the Bible is a big book, but considering that this is the word of God, it comes out of his mouth, and everything is of extreme importance and is significant concerning God's ultimate plans of salvation and judgment and so forth. What would be the purpose besides just some interesting historical tidbits? I won't get into that area. We could spend a long time going to verse after verse after verse that would show us exactly how we must come to the Bible and the things we must look for. You must look for a deeper spiritual meaning. And you won't hear that from the pastors in the churches. They're not taught that in seminary. They're taught their own man-made hermeneutic. And just look at the condition of the churches to see the results of that. Not good condition at all. It's a spiritually desolate condition. And so Christ spoke in parables. Without a parable, he did not speak. That's our guidance. The fact that God, while in the flesh, always, not some of the time, but Christ spoke in parables. Without a parable, he did not speak. Always taught in parables, and it would seem fairly obvious that given that God only entered into the flesh in that way one time in history, so this was his opportunity to instruct all readers of the Bible, given that Jesus is the Word made flesh. So when the Word taught, the Word always spoke in parables. Get it? Do you get it? We're a little thick, and yet God rams that point home in hundreds, if not thousands, of verses. But anyway, here these two men are a figure of the corporate church. Two identifies with caretakers of the word, which the church had that duty, and they kept the door. Christ is the door, he's the word. So keeping the door is maintaining the sharing of the word of God, the declaring, the gospel, the preaching. It all relates to keeping the door. They were pitifully poor doorkeepers. Not good doorkeepers as far as the king's concerned, because they're plotting against him. Same thing with those in the churches and congregations. Pitifully poor doorkeepers. They twist the scriptures, pervert the gospel of grace, add work to grace, sending forth a stinking savor into the nostrils of God. Just very wretchedly poor doorkeepers. And when you're supposed to share the truth in the proper time and season, in the day of salvation, which would minister the doorway, and then it would all be dependent upon God's will, whether any hearing the truth would be drawn to enter in or not. But if you fail to minister the truth, you're not ministering the proper entrance or portal, and so God still worked around that, but he would save his people always. He was faithful, even if doorkeepers were unfaithful. But that's who these men represent. And finally, they're hanged. And, that's what we've been following, the hanging of the baker. The hanging of the baker. The baker we saw, to bake bread identifies with Christ. Again, he's the bread of life and so forth. And we went to Absalom, and now we're spending some time with these two. Now, just one other point, that the book of Esther is amazing because so far, if you would go back, and we're not going to get into it, but in chapter 1 with Ahasuerus, he had a queen named Vashti who refused to come before him, and he finally puts her away. And then there's this call, to obtain a new queen, a new wife, and his good counselors, good chamberlains, they instruct the king, well, have all the virgins come and select a wife from among them. And right away we can see gospel, the gospel as God likens the elect to wise virgins in Matthew 25. There's 5 wise, 5 foolish. And the bridegroom cometh, the bridegroom wanting to or desiring a wife, a bride for himself, and the 5 wise go in, and then the door is shut. So with Vashti, we have a wife of the king put away, and we can see how she would relate to national Israel, because God says he was married to Israel and he divorced her. And then he sought this bride during the New Testament era. Of course, the bride of Christ really can be traced back to the Lord's atoning work performed at the foundation of the world. But as far as history goes, and the way God has laid it out, yeah, there's a progression from going from Israel to now sending the gospel to the nations, and all truly saved become part of the bride. They're also have their sins washed away, so they're purified, like the virgins in the book of Esther would be purified. They're washed, so they receive the spiritual attire of fine white linen, which is the bridal gown. Revelation 19, verse 7 and 8 describes it. It's also the righteousness of the saints. And so we see from chapter 1 Israel into chapter 2 with these 2 doorkeepers. God is moving from Old Testament relationship to national Israel, puts them away, and then develops a New Testament relationship with the churches and congregations. But now with the hanging of the 2 doorkeepers, that points to God's judgment beginning at the house of God and the end of the church age. And notice what is quick on the heels, and yet we can understand this as, practically, since it's occurring practically simultaneously, we can understand it in relationship to the Lord loosing Satan. Satan's rising up and slaying the 2 witnesses of Revelation 11, and we'll look at that verse in a little bit, and see it portrayed or illustrated in this historical parable in chapter 3, right? And chapter 2 ends with they were both hanged on a tree. They're cursed. Chapter 3, verse 1. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. Now, notice that when you receive a promotion, what's one way of looking at it? You're rising up. You're rising up, right? You're promoted. You were at a certain level, now you're higher. That's how we all understand it. And same here, the king Ahasuerus promoted Haman and advanced him and set his seat. His seat in the Bible, the seat identifies with ruling. Set his seat above all the princes that were with him. Now look at Isaiah 14. Isaiah 14 concerning the devil. We read in Isaiah 14 in verse 12, How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. So we see, as I mentioned last time, and we read Esther chapter 6, Haman's desire to be like the king, to be the king. And that relates to Satan's desire to be as the King of glory, God himself. In 2 Thessalonians 2, we read of the man of sin who, it says in verse 4, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Did you notice that? He sitteth in the temple, showing himself he is God. And here the king Ahasuerus promoted Haman. Okay, now if we understand King Ahasuerus to be God, Haman to be Satan, and then we have to ask the question, has God ever promoted or elevated Satan and advanced him and set his seat above the princes that were with God? Yes, yes. And this would tie into the fact that Christ had the keys of hell and death in Revelation 20 and bound Satan. Verse 2, he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. And then we're told he must be loosed a little season. And verse 7, when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison. Okay, so Satan is loosed. Who loosed him? Who loosed him? Same one who bound him. Christ bound him, threw him into the bottomless pit, into condition of hell. Then, at the point of this figurative 1,000 years, which would identify with the end of the church age, he lets him loose. He lets him loose, and Satan, in a bottomless pit, rises up. He comes up, and like Haman, at the point when the two doorkeepers are hanged, is promoted. He's promoted. He's rising up, and his seat is above all these princes. Well, let's go to Revelation 11, and we see concerning the two witnesses, it says in verse 7, and when they shall have finished their testimony. The beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit, see, ascendeth, notice that word, you're coming from beneath. The bottomless pit is also called the deep. It's called the deep, and it is used in relationship to deep water. And so coming up from the deep, you ascend, you're rising. And so at the point of the completion or the finish of the two witnesses' testimony, that's why we say Satan is loosed at the end of the church age. That's why we say the 1,000 years is figurative, because the church age was actually 1955 years, from 33 AD until the year 1988, and the loosing of Satan in Revelation 20 is synonymous with his rising up here, and also rising up in Revelation 13. The beast comes, and there it is. It's viewed as coming up out of the sea in verse 1. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea. And what does the beast in Revelation 13 do? In verse 7, it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds, tongues, and nations. War with the saints. Where do you find the saints? In the church. Revelation 20, going back there, after he's loosed in verse 7, what does he do? He goes and out to deceive the nations, and he gathers Gog and Magog together to battle. Verse 9, and they went up on the breadth of the earth and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city. Comes against the camp of the saints, beloved city, Jerusalem. Both figures, camp of the saints and the beloved city of the corporate church. In Revelation 11, verse 7, the point of the finished testimony of the two witnesses, he rises up. The beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, the two witnesses, and shall overcome them and kill them. Revelation 13 said he would overcome the camp of the saints. You see, it's very consistent. These verses tie together, and so too the historical placement at the end of Esther 2, the two chamberlains, they're hanged, and Haman rises. Haman, a very obvious type of the devil, of Satan, the adversary, the enemy of the Jews, the people of God, the enemy of Mordecai, the type of Christ. And so the death of these two chamberlains at the point of Haman's rise. Very clear spiritual picture when you see it in the light of these verses in Revelation. And so that means we have a continuance from chapter 1, Israel, chapter 2, the church, chapter 3, it's the end of the church age, the time of the Great Tribulation, and it progresses to the point of Judgment Day, when tables are turned, and Haman, who wanted to hang Mordecai, he has to go and lift him up, and then Haman himself is hanged, and circumstantial evidence within the book of Esther itself indicates that Mordecai was hanged on the 17th day of the second month, which would be same date the flood began in Genesis 7. The 17th day of the second month, the flood began. And that is the underlying Hebrew calendar date for May 21, 2011, the beginning of Judgment Day. So just incredible in a book, Esther, that many wonder, why is it in the Bible? the name God isn't mentioned, and yet God lays out beneath the surface in the deeper spiritual meaning. He lays out his entire plan of his relationship to Israel lasted about 2,000 years. His relationship to the church has lasted about 2,000 years. And even the end time loosing of Satan and his rising up to a place of prominence as God gives him rule not only over the church, but over the nations in an unparalleled manner, and then Judgment Day itself. Just incredible, the way God hides truth, but also how he can describe these events in just a few chapters, and it covers such an enormous span of biblical history all the way to the end of time. Well, speaking of the end of time, I think we're going to close our study at this point rather than get into something else. And we do want to get into another important passage or verses that describe Judas hanging himself. Okay, we've seen the bakers hang, how he's a picture of the corporate church. Absalom hung in a tree, picture of the corporate church. The two doorkeepers, the chamberlains to King Ahasuerus, hanged, picture of the corporate church. And yet, what about Judas? What about Judas, who was one of the 12? And he betrayed the Lord. He was infilled with Satan. That's interesting. That's interesting. And he also hanged himself. So we see, that Satan makes appearances, either in figures or whatever, like the Joab with the darts with Absalom, and Haman, who rises up at the point of the hanging of the two chamberlains. And with Judas, he definitely made an appearance. He infilled him. And yeah, that makes us think of the church, doesn't it? Because Satan was loosed and he entered into the churches and congregations very significantly at the end of the church. And what happens to a church under the wrath of God? They're cursed, which is the equivalent of being hanged.
Thank you for joining us for eBible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies and information, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. Until our next Bible study, may the Lord's perfect will be done.